Natalie Brenner was a devoted wife, a beloved librarian, and quietly battling the pain of a marriage turned cold, while her husband, Paul Brenner, a respected fitness coach, was hiding a dark obsession that no one saw coming. When Natalie vanished, without a trace, friends feared the worst, but the chilling truth, buried beneath their own home, revealed a horrifying motive. Paul didn't just want her gone. He believed her body had betrayed him. Paul and Natalie Brenner were the kind of couple people noticed. They lived in a well-kept house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, a quiet suburban street in Oak Ridge where neighbors waved from porches and lawnmowers hummed on Sunday afternoons. Paul, with his sculpted frame and confident stride, was the town's popular fitness trainer. He ran morning boot camps at the local park and posted motivational quotes on social media. Natalie, in contrast, was soft around the edges, quiet, gentle, with a warmth that made children at the school library adore her. They had no kids of their own, but everyone assumed they would eventually. They had the look of stability, the appearance of two people who had built something solid together. But what the neighborhood couldn't see, was the slow unraveling behind closed doors. When they first met in college, Natalie was slimmer, more vibrant, and active. Paul had fallen for her quickly, impressed by her intelligence and calm demeanor. She wasn't just another face in the gym. She had depth, dreams, and the ability to bring calm to his restless energy. They moved in together just a year after graduating, and within 2 more, they were married. Over the years, Natalie's lifestyle shifted. Between long hours at the library and growing anxiety that made her comfort eat and avoid the gym, her weight gradually increased. At first, Paul said nothing. He smiled in photos, made her breakfast smoothies, and joked about how they were getting older together. But soon, the jokes grew sharper, the smiles less frequent. Natalie began to feel his disapproval in the silence after meals, in the way his eyes scanned her body when she walked by, in the way his hands touched her less and less. Paul, obsessed with discipline and control, viewed her weight gain not as a health concern, but a personal betrayal. He began managing their meals with strict rules: no sugar, no carbs, everything weighed and portioned. He started helping her with workouts, forcing her to wake at 5 a.m. to go running, despite her protests of fatigue. When she couldn't keep up, he snapped, told her she didn't care about herself, that she was giving up. He insisted it was for her benefit, but the compassion was gone. It wasn't about her well-being. It was about his shame. His perfect image was cracking. To others, nothing seemed amiss. Paul still posted loving pictures on Instagram, filtered, posed, cropped. Natalie smiled for the camera, but her eyes told another story. She stopped seeing friends, made excuses to avoid gatherings. Her world shrank down to the house, the dog, and the increasingly tense atmosphere around Paul. The home became a place of silence. Conversations turned into instructions. Paul kept a whiteboard in the kitchen where he wrote calorie goals and morning tasks. Natalie, once spontaneous and bright, now moved cautiously through her day. She feared upsetting him, not because he had ever hit her, but because his disappointment was colder than violence. It was relentless and piercing. He had mastered the art of emotional erosion. In her private moments, Natalie started journaling. At first, it was about her struggles with self-esteem. Then it shifted into something darker. Notes about things Paul said to her, things he denied later. How he once whispered that she was wasting her life in that fat body. How he withheld affection when she didn't meet her weight goals. She began writing these moments down not just for clarity, but as evidence. She wasn't sure of what, but something in her had begun to feel unsafe. It'd be why the winter of 2022, Natalie rarely left the house. Paul blamed her weight, saying she was embarrassed to be seen. But the truth was more complex. She was afraid of how tightly the walls were closing in, how much of herself she had lost. Every room reminded her of a former version of herself. Thinner, freer, happier. Paul reminded her of who she no longer was, and who he refused to accept. Still, she stayed. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of habit, maybe because she hoped he would change. But in the early months of 2023, something in Paul shifted even further. The comments stopped, not because he had grown kind again, but because he had grown distant, cold. He no longer looked at her like a person, only like a problem that hadn't gone away. Natalie couldn't have known how far he would go. No one could have. To neighbors, they were still the perfect couple. But something had broken long ago. And soon, the world would see the horrifying cost of that fracture. That on a chilly Monday morning in March, Paul Brenner dialed 911 with a voice that sounded eerily composed. He told the dispatcher that his wife, Natalie, was missing. According to him, they had argued the night before about her health and lifestyle, and she'd stormed out of the house without taking her phone, wallet, or even her shoes. He claimed he waited through the night, expecting her to return, but by morning, she was still gone. He said he was worried, but his tone lacked urgency. The police arrived within the hour. The officers noted the neatness of the house. Nothing seemed disturbed, no sign of struggle. The front door was locked from the inside. Natalie's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were still in the bowl by the door. Her phone was charging in the bedroom. Her shoes were lined up. By the door, nothing out of place, except for Natalie. Paul repeated his story several times. He said she had become emotionally unstable lately, that her weight gain had taken a toll on her mental health. He suggested she may have wandered off or done something drastic. He described her as withdrawn, sad, and overly sensitive. He was painting a picture that suggested she'd simply broken under pressure. But something about his explanation didn't sit right with the detectives. They checked with the neighbors. None of them had seen Natalie leave the house. In fact, several said they hadn't seen her in weeks. One neighbor thought it was strange how she no longer walked the dog. Another recalled seeing Paul jogging alone recently, without his usual running partner. It was as if Natalie had vanished long before Paul made the call. The detectives pulled Natalie's phone records and social media activity. The last text she sent was to her sister 3 days before the disappearance. It was a short message. "I think he hates me." Her sister had responded with concern, but Natalie never replied. Her social media accounts showed no recent activity, no posts, no messages. Nothing suggested that she was planning to leave. Investigators returned to the house for a more thorough search. They noticed the security cameras that Paul had installed himself, a gift, he claimed, to keep them safe after a minor break-in months ago. But when asked for the footage, Paul said the system had malfunctioned a week ago and hadn't been recording. He hadn't bothered to fix it. Suspicion grew. Paul allowed the police to search the property, but he shadowed them closely, answering questions before they were asked, trying too hard to appear cooperative. The lead detective made note of how often Paul brought up Natalie's weight. Every story, every comment, every theory about her disappearance came back to it. He said things like, she wasn't herself anymore, or she stopped trying, like she gave up. He said it so often that it began to feel rehearsed. A week passed, with no sign of Natalie. Missing person posters were taped to telephone poles and pinned to bulletin boards in grocery stores. Paul held a press conference, standing stiffly beside a smiling photo of his wife. He gave a brief statement, then left quickly. Some who watched the footage later remarked that his expression didn't match his words. There were no tears, no urgency. While the town hoped for answers, the detectives dug deeper. They pulled Paul's financial records and online activity. They found recent purchases that raised eyebrows: heavy-duty plastic sheets, industrial cleaner, and noise-canceling earplugs. When asked, Paul said he was renovating the basement and hadn't gotten around to it yet. But when officers checked, there was no sign of renovation, just a clean, empty space with a faint chemical smell. They brought in cadaver dogs, who reacted to an area near the crawl space beneath the house. The soil was recently disturbed. A forensic team was called in, and Paul was asked to leave the property during the investigation. He didn't argue. He only asked if they would need long. It didn't take long. Beneath the floorboards, wrapped in layers of plastic and duct tape, they found Natalie's body. She had been there for days. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the head as the cause of death. She had likely died the same night Paul reported her missing. Paul was arrested at a friend's house later that evening. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded when officers told him Natalie's body had been found. The case had shifted from a missing person to a homicide. The town that once admired Paul for his discipline and charm was now left stunned. Natalie hadn't run away. She hadn't snapped. She had been silenced, hidden, and discarded by the man she had trusted most. And the chilling truth was only beginning to surface. News of Paul Brenner's arrest spread through Oak Ridge like wildfire. The man who once led sunrise workouts and posted inspirational gym selfies was now in custody, accused of murdering his wife and hiding her body beneath their own home. The image the community had built of him, disciplined, focused, charismatic, collapsed overnight. People were stunned, not just by the crime, but by the motive that began to emerge from the investigation. It wasn't about money. It wasn't jealousy or infidelity. It was something far more chilling. Appearance AS detectives combed through Paul's personal devices. A disturbing pattern took shape. His search history was saturated with sites discussing body image, extreme dieting, and even forums where people shared hateful views about partners who gained weight. One post stood out. Paul had written on a message board under an anonymous handle, "Is it emotional abuse if I can't stand to look at her anymore? I feel like she's punishing me with her body." The language was cruel and cold, showing no empathy for Natalie's humanity, only a fixation on how she had changed physically. Detectives also found detailed searches in the weeks before her death. Phrases like "how to dispose of a body without getting caught," "decomposition timeline," and "how long before a missing person case turns cold" were all in his browser history. Even more disturbing were purchases made on his credit card: a crowbar, cleaning agents, rubber gloves, and an electric saw, which was never recovered. The timeline pointed to premeditation. Paul had planned something, and he had planned it thoroughly. In the basement, investigators found traces of bleach on the concrete and drag marks that led to the crawl space. There were tiny droplets of blood mist during the initial search, now illuminated under forensic lighting. They also found one of Natalie's journals tucked behind a loose wall panel, as if she had hidden it away. The entries were heartbreaking. She wrote about feeling invisible, about how Paul looked through her like she didn't exist. One entry read, "He doesn't touch me. He doesn't look at me. I think he wants me to disappear." The most damning evidence, however, came from her phone. Though Paul had claimed it was found untouched, digital forensics revealed recently deleted voice memos. Natalie had been recording their conversations. One recording, dated a week before her death, captured Paul's voice in an icy tone saying, "I didn't sign up for this. You don't even try anymore. Do you even see what you've become?" She didn't reply. The silence after his words was heavy, filled with the weight of someone who had nothing left to say. In another memo, she recorded herself talking quietly, almost in a whisper. She said, "If something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. I'm scared of Paul, but I don't know how to leave. He's watching everything. He always knows when I've eaten too much, when I don't exercise. I think he hates me for what I look like." This audio was the final piece. It was raw, intimate, and damning. It destroyed any attempt the defense might have made to portray Paul as mentally unstable or emotionally overwhelmed. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a calculated, methodical erasure of a woman because she no longer met her husband's standard of beauty. Paul's behavior during questioning only confirmed the portrait emerging. He didn't deny the murder. He admitted hitting her, but insisted it got out of control. He blamed her depression, her weight, her lack of effort. He framed himself as a victim of disappointment, not a killer. The detectives, listening to him rationalize, realized he didn't see Natalie as a person anymore. She had become an object of resentment, something that reflected badly on him, and he had destroyed her like someone discarding broken equipment that I in the courtroom. The prosecution built a solid case with a clear motive. Paul's obsession with control, his rigid views on appearance, and his psychological manipulation of Natalie painted a vivid, horrifying picture. The defense had little to argue. The recordings, the journals, the digital trail, it was overwhelming. For Natalie's family, the evidence was both a relief and a burden. They had suspected something was wrong, but had never imagined the truth would be so brutal. They wept quietly as the audio played in court, hearing her voice, knowing how afraid she must have been, yet how trapped she had felt. There had been no dramatic fight, no violent struggle, just a slow erasure of her identity, followed by a fatal blow from the man she had once trusted with her heart. The jury took less than 4 hours to deliberate. The verdict would come quickly, but for Natalie, the sentence had already been carried out, and it was final. Paul Brenner sat motionless as the jury returned to the courtroom. The weight of the evidence had left little room for doubt. His face was blank, unreadable, the same expression he had worn throughout the trial. He looked neither remorseful nor afraid, only distant, as if this was happening to someone else. The judge read the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the town of Oak Ridge, the case was over, but for investigators, there were still pieces left to examine. Questions about how Paul had managed to carry out such a crime without anyone suspecting, and how Natalie had hidden her suffering in plain sight for so long. In the weeks that followed the verdict, new information came to light that painted an even more disturbing portrait of the life Natalie had endured. Natalie's sister, Hannah, came forward with more journal pages she had found in a small box of belongings Natalie had given her just a month before her death. At the time, Natalie had said she was cleaning up old clutter and wanted her sister to hold on to it in case she needed it later. Inside were printouts of online conversations Natalie had had with anonymous support groups. She had been reaching out for help under a fake name, describing her situation to strangers in hopes of understanding what was happening to her. She had written about the rules Paul enforced, how he made her take daily photos of her meals to send, and while he was at work, how she had to log her weight in a shared spreadsheet, and how he once unplugged the refrigerator for a weekend to make her think about her eating habits. She described it all not as abuse, but as motivation. It was clear she was trying to justify his behavior, trying to protect him even as she withered emotionally under his control. She also mentioned that he had once joked about her becoming a statistic. At the time, she thought it was a dark attempt at humor. After her death, those words echoed with sinister meaning. Digital forensics also uncovered emails that Paul had sent to a friend months before the murder. In one, he described Natalie as a dead weight I'm chained to. In another, he said he sometimes fantasized about life without her dragging me down. These weren't just cruel thoughts. They were signs of a mind already walking toward murder. When those messages were shown to the jury, they sealed his fate. But it wasn't only Paul's cruelty that horrified people. It was how easily he had masked it. At the gym, he was still laughing with clients, sharing fitness tips, and taking group selfies. He led charity events and volunteered for local fundraisers. Even as his marriage crumbled behind closed doors, he played the role of the devoted husband. That mask never slipped, not even once. Meanwhile, Natalie's world had grown smaller and smaller. Her co-workers at the library admitted they had noticed changes. She was quieter, more distracted, prone to spacing out. But when they asked if everything was okay, She always smiled and said yes. She had become a master at hiding pain, covering bruises of the heart, not the skin. Even the family dog, Toby, had been sent away just weeks before Natalie's death. Paul claimed he was shedding too much, but investigators believed it was one more way to isolate Natalie, stripping away the last bit of comfort she had left. Without Toby, the silence in the house had been complete. After the trial, Natalie's sister founded a local support group for women in controlling relationships. She named it Still Natalie. The group met every Wednesday night in the basement of a local church. Survivors came forward, quietly, cautiously, and then in larger numbers. They spoke about how hard it was to recognize abuse when there were no bruises, no shouting, only silence and shame and slow erosion. Paul was transferred to a maximum security prison out of state. He made no statements, gave no interviews. The house on Hawthorne Lane was sold within months, its cheerful yellow shutters painted over in dull gray. No one wanted to remember what had happened there, but no one could forget, and Natalie's grave became a place of quiet pilgrimage. People left notes, flowers, books. One small card, handwritten in careful letters, said simply, "You were enough. You always were." For a long time, Natalie had believed her worth was tied to how she looked. But her story revealed something else entirely: how dangerous it can be when someone stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a problem. And how silence, in the hands of someone cruel, can be the sharpest weapon of all. In the months after the trial, Oak Ridge tried to return to normal, but the shadow of Natalie Brenner's death lingered. Her story wasn't just another crime statistic. It was a haunting reminder of how control can look like care, how cruelty can wear a smile, and how easily someone can be erased by the person they trusted most. Paul Brenner had vanished from the town's collective memory like a bad dream people wanted to forget, but Natalie's name remained. It was spoken in classrooms, whispered at grocery stores, written in chalk on sidewalks during awareness walks. Her absence was louder than her presence had ever been allowed to be. The local library where Natalie once worked, her desk remained untouched for weeks. The staff couldn't bring themselves to clear it out. Eventually, they turned the corner where she sat into a small memorial. A framed photo, a few of her favorite children's books, and a small plaque that read, "Kindness leaves a mark." Patrons left sticky notes with messages for her. "Thank you for helping me find my first book," one child wrote. Another note, scribbled in shaky handwriting, simply read, "I wish I had known. I would have said something." Hannah, Natalie's sister, became the most vocal advocate for domestic emotional abuse awareness. She spoke at schools, support groups, and even on a televised segment about invisible abuse. She told Natalie's story, not to shame, not to blame, but to open eyes. She described how Natalie had slowly been made to feel small, how her spirit had been chipped away, not in bursts, but in a daily, grinding erosion that left her defenseless. She didn't die because she was overweight, Hannah said in one interview. She died because someone stopped seeing her as a person and started seeing her as a reflection of his disappointment. The support group, Still Natalie, grew rapidly. What began with 5 women in a church basement became a community of dozens. Some had similar stories: partners who monitored their food, commented constantly on their appearance, isolated them from family under the disguise of love. They all echoed a similar feeling: that their pain wasn't bad enough to speak about until they heard Natalie's story. Now, they spoke freely. Some left toxic relationships. Some began therapy. Many simply stopped blaming themselves. Meanwhile, Paul began his life behind bars at a state penitentiary. He remained silent through the intake process and never requested visitors. Other inmates quickly learned of his case, and while he wasn't physically harmed, he became an outcast. A man who once stood tall on workout mats and barked out orders was now another number, moving in line like everyone else. He spent most of his days in silence, refusing to speak about Natalie. He hadn't appealed the conviction. He hadn't written a letter to her family. He gave no apology. It was as if, in his mind, the case had closed with her death. Detectives who had worked the case occasionally met to debrief. Something about it had unsettled even the most seasoned among them. It wasn't just the brutality, it was the calm, the slow burn of control, the deliberate planning, the cold execution. One investigator later admitted, he didn't lose control. He exercised it right to the end. Natalie's final recording, which was never played in court out of sensitivity, remained archived. It was just her voice, softly describing her hope that maybe, someday, Paul would see her again, not as a failure, not as a burden, but as the woman he once loved. That recording, discovered on her phone days after her body was found, never made it to the public, but those who heard it said it was the most human moment in the entire case. A quiet plea from someone who had been turned into a ghost long before her life was taken. Eventually, the house on Hawthorne Lane was demolished. Too many people had driven by just to stare. A small park was built in its place, with a bench and a tree planted in Natalie's memory. No sign mentioned how she died, only that she lived and that she mattered. Her story became more than a tragedy. It became a warning, a message that love is not control, that cruelty doesn't always come with bruises, and that no one deserves to be judged, measured, or discarded for their appearance. Natalie Brenner wasn't a perfect woman, or a perfect wife, or a perfect anything. She was simply a human being, deserving of respect, compassion, and love. And the chilling truth wasn't just that Paul killed her because she was overweight. It was that, in his eyes, that was reason enough.